All right. Hello, everyone. We're here today with Dana Perls, who's a campaigner with Friends of the Earth US, and she'll tell you a little bit more about what she does in that role. But first, I wanted to just ask, well, so Dana and I met years ago when we were both involved in the San Francisco Urban Agriculture Alliance and stuff relating to urban agriculture. And she was very active in a lot of campaigns around pesticides at the time, trying to get them out of the food supply. So Dana, now you have like other realms of work, which we're going to talk about, related, but other realms. How did you end up getting into this whole world of agriculture and reforming it and whatnot in the first place? What brought you here?
It was a long and winding journey, but when I was living in Panama doing Peace Corps work, there was a big mega dam project that was threatening the whole area where I was living. And so from a space of human rights, I started focusing on water as a human right, and the role that corporations play in taking that away for use in what they call development. And so then when I came back home to California and started learning about water as a human right, that very quickly led me to water contamination, because in California, a lot of people don't have water because of contaminants from agriculture. So as you just said, I started getting into pesticides as kind of one of the causes of why people don't have their clean drinking water, which is something everybody should have. And then when I started working for Friends of the Earth, we kind of peel back the onion a little bit more, peel back the layers of like, well, what's driving the increased use of pesticides? And biotech companies, genetic engineering, the same companies that make the pesticides are also creating applications that put you on a treadmill. Like, you have to use the pesticides in order to grow the genetically engineered crop. And so, and then as you get deeper and deeper into the corporate control over agriculture, you get more into biotech applications, which is mostly what I look at. But it all started with that place of having the human right to clean water, the human right to access to uncontaminated land, and to grow your own food.
It's interesting because we think of, Friends of the Earth being an environmental organization, and a lot of times the issues of pesticides being treated, or agriculture's impacts broadly, often treated as environmental, but it sounds like you sort of started from the social angle and it just linked naturally to these environmental questions.
Yeah, I mean, they are environmental questions, but they're also social questions, and they're cultural questions. A lot of the questions that I ask is like, who has the right to decide what our world looks like? Should a corporation have the right to decide if an entire ecosystem is going to be genetically engineered, not just today, but in future generations? And as the world of biotech and agriculture changes into technologies that engineer future generations, it's not just an environmental question, it's a health question, it's a cultural question, it's a societal question, it's a question around democracy, and really asking the question of who gets to decide what this world is like, and who has access to resources. And you get very quickly into questions around race and equity and gender and class.
So I want to go back just a second, because I think this connection between pesticides and genetically modified stuff isn't necessarily straightforward to a lot of people. So like, what when you were
Sure.
first trying to do that, because now I know that biotech is a really large thing with a lot of different sort of
Yeah.
avenues, but this original connection between agriculturally used pesticides and GMO crops, what is the connection there?
Yeah, and it's changed, but originally, particularly after World War II, we had a huge amount of leftover chemicals from chemical warfare, and big agrochemical companies started using chemicals from warfare, like the glyphosate that's found in Roundup, for agricultural crops. You know, not only does it kill people, but it also kills insects. And so the genetically engineered seeds started out at you know, what we call GMOs 1.0, were like corn and soy and cotton. And the seeds were engineered to be either tolerant of a certain pesticide or to make them more vulnerable to a pesticide. But the idea is that, like, if I planted BT cotton, a type of genetically engineered cotton, I would be able to spray it with a certain cocktail of pesticides, and everything around it will die, but not the cotton. Or if I were to be spraying Roundup, which it contains glyphosate on a bunch of crops, maybe it will also kill everything else. It'll kill all the weeds, but it won't kill the crop. That was the idea. It didn't work. It turns out that it created a system where not only do you, if in order to plant that seed, the genetically engineered seed, you have to buy the company's pesticide that's correlated with the seed. And it puts farmers in a system where if they buy a seed, they have to buy the pesticides. And as the plants became more and more tolerant, turns out plants, like all organisms, evolve, and they have developed a resistance to the engineered trait, and that necessitates more pesticides. So actually the data at this point is very clear that genetically engineered seeds often require more use of pesticides and even more use of water as well. There were a lot of promises made in the 70s that these are going to help reduce the use of pesticides, reduce the use of water, have greater yields. And now, after 40 years or more of data, it turns out that none of that is actually true. These seeds are not meant they're not designed for microclimate systems, and so oftentimes they're not appropriate for the regions where they're planted. And so farmers needed to use more water. Farmers have needed to use far more pesticides, and the yield hasn't always resulted in a greater amount. In fact, there's a lot of data that suggests that the yield has been worse than other conventional, not genetically engineered, but still conventional agriculture. Now the field of genetic engineering looks very different, though. We used to just be focused on the seeds of corn and soy and cotton, and at this point, genetic engineers have really expanded that. They're still focused on corn, soy, and cotton because those are the biggest commodity crops, but it's actually, genetic engineering has expanded to engineering whole ecosystems. And that includes genetically engineered microbes, the most common microbes on our planet, like the microorganisms like yeast and algae. There are genetically engineered insects, genetically engineered animals. They're trying to do genetically engineered soil microbes. So we're starting to see a shift. And then there's things that remain the same. The same companies that are making the pesticides are the companies that are making all of these other genetically engineered products with the same goal, which is to really lock us in to a conventional agrochemical-led system, right? Or in the case of animals, how do you really strengthen the system of CAFOs, the confined animal factory system, factory farming? So genetic engineering is meant to lock us in to this agrochemical system, which necessitates more pesticides. It necessitates the same chemical fertilizer, which is causing a lot of problems in our ecosystem with the like algae bloom chemical fertilizer runoffs. And but it's less about the individual seeds, and now genetic engineers are expanding to how do we engineer the whole ecosystem, the agricultural system writ large.
And yeah, that makes me think, I remember when we worked together, there was stuff going on around these new ideas of gene drives, right? Which sounds very much more intense than sort of just a combination of, a chemical to kill life and a seed that's, engineered to
Yeah.
shoot it. Could you explain like what is a gene drive and what,
Yeah.
yeah,
It's,
what
so a gene drive is a product that companies are trying to make. They don't exist yet, but the idea is basically an extinction an extinction gene. So, and an extinction gene that will permanently engineer all future generations. So imagine that you engineer a fly to have yellow eyes, and that you could take a single fly and drop it into a population, and within 5 generations, all flies in the world have yellow eyes. The idea is that there are genetic engineers who are trying to engineer basically the reproductive system, like the eggs or the sperm of organisms, or whatever their reproductive system is for plants and insects in particular. And the idea is that you drive a certain trait through an entire population, both present and future. And the companies that are really most interested in this are the big agrochemical companies, because they want to permanently engineer plants to forever be dependent on Roundup, or permanently engineer another plant so that it is only susceptible to your pesticides. The DARPA, the Department of Defense, is also really interested in gene drives for bioweapons. Like, what happens if you were to drop a virus or a seed into a population that permanently crashes their agricultural system, or that the use that is most popular, although it's kind of a Trojan horse, is the idea that you could create a mosquito that will kill all mosquitoes and therefore eradicate things like malaria or dengue. There are hundreds of mosquitoes, and so you're not going to eradicate mosquitoes. But what it does, and it also just doesn't work. The people in the places, particularly in Mali and in Burkina Faso and South Africa, are vehemently against the use of these. And currently, the United Nations Convention on Biodiversity has language around a moratorium. Right now, that's not a full moratorium, but basically at the international level, there's the conversation is that something like a gene drive has gone too far. Like, just because we can engineer an organism to do something doesn't mean we should. This is kind of like the atomic bomb, but for agriculture.
well, it's really interesting. I'm glad to hear there's some pushback against it, because it's both.
We're trying.
Yeah, it's
It's a
both an
campaign.
thing. Well, I want to ask you in a little bit about sort of campaigns, what that looks like, what is the work that you actually do around these issues. But one thing I wanted to address, and maybe have you address, but that comes to mind, is how much you mentioned the Trojan horse of like, oh, we're gonna solve malaria. I feel like that's been the narrative for genetically modified organisms since their advent, is how they're going to solve all of these tough problems.
Yeah.
And essentially they're sort of pitched as something that's for humanity, right? It's either to reduce pesticides so we're better for the planet, or it's to, solve drought in areas and make more drought tolerant crops so that, Africa can feed itself again. And from my knowledge, like, yeah, so many of these examples that were purported to be good never really panned out, never really did what they
They've
were.
all failed. And in
So,
fact, not only do they fail, they cause more problems.
mhm. Well, I was going to ask you, it's like, seems crazy to think that now there's even things that are even more potentially damaging in their impacts, right? Causing impacts through industrial ag is one thing, but to actually wipe out a species, thinking that that's good, and then not knowing what the ecological effects are of that getting wiped out. I mean, it seems like so crazy. So why do you think that this narrative persists of GMOs as being helpful? I mean, because I've seen it also in my students. There's always some students who are like, well, I think GMOs are probably helpful for us. We shouldn't be so skeptical of them. So I'm wondering, like, why is this so persistent as an idea?
You know, the chemical industry, the agrochemical industry has always had a lot of lobbying power and a lot of influence over regulators. This is a multi-billion-dollar industry that is incredibly dangerous to people, to public health, to the environment. And unfortunately, the trend that we've seen over the years is a trend of corporate capture, where you have companies like Monsanto, Syngenta, and other biotech companies pushing for a deregulatory trend. And so you have a lot of promises, a lot of PR suggesting, oh, here's all the things that we are going to try to do, and then failures. But you also have a lot of money going to support senators. I mean, we're getting into a lot of the corruption realm, but when you have decision makers and regulatory agencies that are being run by the agrochemical industry, right? We get into this revolving door where the head of one of these agrochemical companies now runs the USDA or now runs the FDA. But we have a regulatory problem where so much of our government is run by corporate shills, essentially. And the data coming out of international bodies, you know, like the WHO and the FAO and the United Nations, are very clear that actually the type of agriculture which is most sustainable, that is going to be best for conservation of biodiversity, that puts the most food on people's plate is our agricultural systems like agroecology, that are local, that are organic, that are not dependent on the biochemicals. But in the same way that you see fossil fuel companies like Shell and Chevron and various petroleum companies, in the same way that they manage to get their products onto the market with all sorts of promises, we see the same thing in agriculture, but it really it's detrimental. So much of our problems with climate, with contamination, public health pandemics come down to agriculture, and a lot of the fingers point to these agrochemical companies.
Yeah, I mean, I remember like the last time I think you came to this class, we were in the wake of the Impossible Burger, right? And that was another example
Right.
where there was this flood of
Another greenwashing example.
yeah, and well, but I was thinking of like, you know, again, how for students and a lot of people just who aren't necessarily like following these issues day to day, the idea of a non-meat burger is appealing, right? That seems very environmental to have a product that allows people to eat something that tastes like meat without it being made from factory farmed animals, right? So could you describe a little bit about like the Impossible Burger and just, you know,
Yeah.
dynamics of that?
You know, you have, if there's a product where you think, oh, it's almost too good to be true, it's probably too good to be true. And I think just at a fundamental level, the idea that you can have this silver bullet single product solve a very complex ecological problem, a complex problem created by capitalism, which is factory farming. You know, it's too simplistic, and it's not actually how complex problems get solved. But in the short, it's really important to look at how a product is made, who's paying for it. The Impossible Foods company is part of a much larger kind of Silicon Valley investor-run agrochemical company. They are very clear about their use of genetically engineered soy and have many statements out saying that genetically engineered soy is safe and it's healthy for people and it's healthy for the environment. So just right out of the bat, you know, they are very deeply embedded with companies like Monsanto and Syngenta and Dow DuPont who make these genetically engineered products. But if you go at a deeper level, you run into a problem of these new genetically engineered products. So the whole special sauce of the Impossible Burger is based on this genetically engineered protein. So what they do is they take a genetically engineered yeast and then they try to design it so that it pumps out something similar to an animal protein. They don't actually do a good job. Turns out we don't know how to control nature. We can't even genetically engineer corn, let alone create, animal proteins. So they kind of created something similar to, but which causes a lot of health problems. So you have the yeast, and kind of like as if you were to brew beer, you have to feed the yeast a lot of sugar. So now here comes more genetically engineered sugar. So you have a lot of genetically engineered sugar feeding yeast, and it squirts out this protein substitute. And then that protein substitute is what they claim creates this animal flavor. The problem is, one, now you have a product that is completely dependent on some of the most environmentally destructive commodity crops that we have. Genetically engineered sugar and genetically engineered soy use a huge amount of pesticides. You also have a problem in terms of climate, because these factories that create the products, the genetically engineered protein, run 24 hours a day and consume a huge amount of energy. You also have a problem of the fact that there are a lot of public health issues associated with the protein. There were different lab tests that were done using rats, and it showed all sorts of different problems, from blood clotting issues to liver damage to reproductive health issues, that the company ignored, and they're allowed to ignore because we don't have regulations for things like new genetically engineered proteins. So the way our regulatory system works is, if it's new and we haven't looked at it and there are no regulations for it, they say, well, we don't have any regulations that say you can't do this, so welcome aboard. Now, a lot of people are going to say, yeah, but it's not as bad as cows. Factory farming is terrible, they're pollutant, and they impact climate change. And that's the false dichotomy that Impossible Food wants you to look at, because actually there's a lot of data that look at, well, let's compare factory farming and those cows to a veggie burger that doesn't use genetically engineered proteins. Okay, now let's compare factory farmed cows with a non-GMO burger. Now let's compare it to an organic veggie burger. Now let's compare it to an organically raised cow, a pasture-raised cow. Anything other than just comparing a cow to Impossible Burger, it turns out that all the other options fare far better in terms of climate, in terms of pollutants, in terms of energy use. So Impossible Foods wants you to think that because cows and in factory farm systems are a nightmare, which they are, that the only solution is to eat this highly genetically engineered, highly processed product, which perpetuates the very agricultural system run by agrochemical companies that have caused all the problems in the first place. They are one and the same with those companies, but they have a really smooth, multi-million-dollar PR team. Millions just for PR. They need that money in order to convince you that you want this. They don't say that it's genetically engineered. They don't say the number of chemicals that it requires or the energy use, because then you're not going to want it. But there are so many other solutions that are far better that they don't talk about. Pasture-raised organic cows, organic veggie burgers, even just a non-GMO burger that's not organic, all of those actually turn out to have a far better footprint for sustainability. That's my rant about the Impossible Burger.
That was you encapsulated a lot in one. I was thinking when you first said that, oh, now they promote, oh yeah, it's a safe GMO, right? That's now their thing. But if I remember correctly, when they first rolled out the Impossible Burger, they didn't mention GMOs at all.
They didn't mention. We had to launch a campaign just to get them to say what was in it, because they knew that if they said that these were genetically engineered, people wouldn't want it. And so the whole reason that they need millions of dollars is to figure out basically how to say what it is without saying what it is.
Well, I just thought that in terms of your your comment of, if it sounds too good to be good true, it probably isn't. I think it's important to also remember these things of taking skeptically what a company says about its great, green
Yeah,
credentials. Like chances are they're telling you all
yeah,
of that for a reason, which is other than because it's ethical.
yeah.
Um, so I wanted to shift a little bit into more maybe the tangible, the nitty gritty of what does it mean to organize around these issues? What is the kind of stuff you
Mhm.
do to, I mean, it sounds like a lot of it has to do with regulations. And could you talk about sort of what happens in the US, since a lot of it is probably about USDA and
Sure.
policy?
Yeah, there's a couple different levels. There's organizing with frontline communities, organizing with farm workers, organizing with farmers. Um, there's organizing at the like market level, so working to educate consumers so that they can essentially vote with their dollars, and using consumer pressure to get companies to change their policies. So even though they're allowed to use all sorts of toxic chemicals that cause neurological problems and reproductive problems and contaminate the environment, they're allowed to do that. But what if a huge number of their consumers say, oh, we're not going to buy your product and unless you change what's in the food? So there's a market-based level that we can work on. And then there's the federal policy level where in the best case scenario, we have a government that actually takes care of the environment, and ideally we have a government that takes care of people's health. We haven't had that in a while, but certainly a lot of the work that we do is to try and put pressure on our government agencies to have scientifically sound third-party assessments, as opposed to the companies coming in and doing their own self-assessment. Right now, a lot of what happens with genetic engineering is the fox guarding the hen house, where the company is like, hey, we did all of these tests on our products and we found our products are safe. And then the FDA or the USDA, really the USDA, says, oh, okay, great, thanks, come on over. So organizing is a lot of education. It's a lot about finding the points of intervention. Like if we want to see a change, where are the places where we put that pressure? And then how do we mobilize? And how do we mobilize as many people as possible? How do we make it clear that this is urgent? And how do we work with many groups, right? We know that the environment and agriculture, it's not just about non-GMOs, it's not just about organic, it's working with people from all across the interconnected disciplines to try and come together and pressure both companies, because we live in a capitalist world where companies have a lot of decision-making power, and then keep pressuring our government, because ideally we get to a place where we have a government that makes the decisions as opposed to the corporations. So
And
it's a lot of mobilizing and educating.
yeah. And then how does that, because you mentioned the CBD, the Convention
Mm-hmm.
on Biological Diversity. So how would you relate sort of this national level stuff to some of these things that happen at the international level?
Sure. Well, then you have the United Nations or the FAO or the World Health Organization, and they're making guidelines and recommendations for all the countries who come together. The United Nations Convention on Biodiversity is an interesting place because the US sits that one out, right? So basically all countries in the world are part of this convention except for the US and the Vatican. The Vatican isn't a country, but it's considered a player. So so the UN is a really important place because we live in a global we live in a global market, and agriculture is global. And so what happens in one country affects everybody, particularly if you have a technology designed to spread through the environment, like a gene drive. Australia could decide that they want to release a gene drive, and now they've made a decision on behalf of the entire world. So really, as things become more and more global, we need to have global decision making. And granted, it might just be a recommendation or it might be a guideline, but it becomes really important that we're working on sound environmental and public health rules. And, we have things like climate change, where what one person does in one country or what one country does writ large affects the whole world. And that's the same with agriculture. It really, what we do in the United States affects everywhere and vice versa. So I do a lot of lobbying at the United Nations. And even though the US doesn't sign on to the agreement, if all the other countries do, the US will essentially have to fall in line eventually.
Or at least there's like that pressure where, for example, I guess if there's a if what the companies based in the US who kind of control the system here want to do is sell a product abroad, and all of the other countries are saying, no, we're not allowing these products, then it disincentivizes the sort of policy apparatus here to push that forward. Although we did see under Trump, there was definitely some strong efforts to do that anyway, right? I mean, there's
Yeah.
definitely like a dead set nature of like pushing back against agroecology, pushing back on anything that questions the industrial
Yeah.
sort of paradigm. Um, so earlier, before we started recording, you had started talking about your more recent work, and I wanted to hear maybe more about that in terms of this whole new realm of kind of precision agriculture, which I know my first impression of precision agriculture was that there's an attempt by industrial players to sort of adopt the green views of the opposition, right? All this pushback against their model. And they've said, well, we care about the environment too. And one of the ways we do it is by reducing the amount of inputs, right? The pesticides, the fertilizers we use, right? We don't want to use this stuff. It costs our farmers money, even though really they're the ones selling it to the farmers. So they do want the farmers to use a lot. But putting that aside, they basically say, no, it's going to be fine. We're going to be smarter and smarter by getting more and more precise with our tractors and such. So that was my understanding. Precision
Yeah.
agriculture. Can you talk about, and how
Yeah.
does
It's
that
a
relate?
little more it's a little more complicated and nuanced, So we have these terms that you start hearing: digital ag and precision ag, and then you have all these genetically engineered products. And essentially, the puzzles are coming together, where you have companies that are trying to control the entire agricultural system. They've genetically engineered the seeds, they've genetically engineered the animals, the insects, the soil microbes, the pesticides, and now you have this attempt by these same chemical companies that are now partnering with big data companies, so Google and Microsoft and Alibaba and the Gates Foundation and Microsoft, but you have an even bigger merger of agrochemical companies and big data companies. And now we're moving into a new realm of conventional agriculture that is this merger of biotech and data and AI, and with fun terms like precision ag and digital agriculture. But actually, you need to really dig a little bit deeper. One, there's a problem in terms of how they're approaching agriculture. Most farmers will tell you that it's an ecosystem. What's happening in one corner of your farm affects the other corner of your farm, right? You need to really look at what's happening at the farm level to understand what your soil needs. And this idea that we can just pretend that an ecosystem is like a motherboard is what is happening in genetic engineering. Like, oh, I could just remove this gene and put another gene in, but actually it messes the entire organism up. It's not like that. Everything is very interwoven. And that same systematic thinking that I can just go into a farm and spot check that piece and spot check that piece takes away the idea that an agricultural system is an ecosystem, and it's very mechanistic, and it's problematic in terms of actually taking care of soil, taking care of the land. Some people might argue, well, but what if all the inputs are organic? Then does that work? Yes, but now you're in a dreamy fantasy land, because as with anything, you have to look at who's designing it, who owns it, who's it for. And so as you peel back the first layer of precision agriculture and digital agriculture, it very immediately get to these big same agrochemical companies partnering now with these big data companies like Google and Microsoft. And so now you think, okay, well, these are the companies that own it, and not the farmers. So the farmers are not going to be in control of their own land. There's questions around data control. There's questions around your own personal data, like as a farmer, your farm's data. There's questions about kind of, yeah, who owns it? It's the agrochemical companies and the data companies. And who's it for? It's for the commodity crop farmers. It's for the big companies that are going to be able to afford it. And so very quickly, you have to be asking, like, well, if you're a small organic farmer or even a medium-sized organic farmer, you're not going to be able to afford the technology as it is. But the companies that control this precision ag or that are designing it for certain inputs. They're designing it for chemical inputs. They're designing it for the genetically engineered crops. They're designing it for the genetically engineered insects. And it just raises also a lot of questions. You know, if you think about Facebook, and there's this thing of like data nudging, micro nudging, where like maybe you have a whole bunch of ads popping up on the side of your screen, and eventually you're like, oh yeah, I do want that product. Or you think about these same Facebook social media companies that ended up playing big roles in some problems related to democracy. And the ability for those same sort of platforms to micro nudge our agricultural system is also a really important thing that we have to think about. And that's not about seeds and pesticides, but data companies are about controlling and influencing and affecting decisions and gathering lots of data to figure out how to move to sell a product that your partner is wanting to sell. So there's so many layers. There are a lot of layers of problems that move us away from local control. It moves us away from everything that agroecology stands for, you know, where individual farmers own their land, own their crops, own their own data. It moves us away from,
right? Isn't that a thing to fix it? Like for farmers that do use tractors, that was a long tradition of
you might not be able to fix it.
Tractors, right? With this new, that's already the case before the big data.
Yeah.
Already tractors that are not legally allowed to be worked on unless the company.
There's a lot of property right questions. There's a whole movement amongst farmers called the right to repair movement. And these are farmers who are having to hack their own tractors just to figure out how to fix them, because maybe you have to otherwise take your tractor 200 miles away and pay a lot of money, more than the tractor is worth, to fix it. So really, I think it's important when you look at a product, whether it's the Impossible Burger or you know, something like precision ag or a genetically engineered seed, and say, well, who owns it? Who is this being designed for? Where is the money coming from? And how is this, in the case of like the Impossible Burger, you know, how is it made? What are the inputs? And you get very quickly to a lot of, you get very quickly back to that same perpetual cycle of dependency on chemicals, and the dependency on a very problematic agricultural system that locks farmers into to very specific products that are part of the reason that we have problems with climate change and soil contamination and water contamination and air contamination. And really, to move away from that, we need to focus on what's working, and that's agroecology. And we need to focus on organic agriculture and making it even better, you know, rather than trying to innovate new silver bullets that sound really good but don't work. Like, let's focus on the thing that we know actually works and supports conservation of biodiversity and supports livelihoods and supports really healthy food solutions. And that's not any of these food tech products. That's agroecology, that's organic agriculture.
Well, there's one thing that came to mind that I wanted to mention when you're talking about the sort of data stuff, is that there's a parallel with this sort of hubris of management, right? Where the genetic engineering is all these reductionist assumptions about how genes work. that, you know, if you ask genetic scientists, they'll often be clear, like, yeah, we kind of know how this works, and but we're not totally sure. And then we do experiments, and it turns out there's things we don't know, right? But then you ask genetic engineering proponents and the companies, and they're like, we know exactly what we're doing, and it's all super figured out, right? And they're chaotic systems that they treat as though they're totally
Well,
understandable.
that's about investors, right? In
Well,
order to pay for your research, you need investors, and you need to tell the investors it's going to work.
I guess what I'm trying to say
And
is that there's
yeah,
that aspect on the ecological, biological side is paralleled with the way algorithms work. And if we look at how big data companies work, they also claim to be able to control and to manage all of this
that's
data
right.
that they're doing, but really they often use algorithms now increasingly based on artificial intelligence, where they themselves literally don't actually know what the
Yeah,
algorithms are doing.
yeah,
And so there's a
yeah,
sense at which there's also like no real control there, but a claim of a control, you know, in
yeah.
some direction based on profit motive.
And also looking at who's designing the products, I think is important. There was a problem a while ago with Facebook where Facebook was doing name recognition and there, or not name recognition, face recognition. And I read this in an article that Black men were being labeled as gorillas, and there was a problem with Facebook's algorithm that they weren't recognizing. You know, like white people were not being mislabeled as polar bears. You know, but so they took it out. And the point that the article was making is people claim that algorithms are neutral. They're not. You know, that's one way we're going to get away from racism or corporate control, or you know, we're going to get to equity by using neutral algorithms. But those algorithms were designed by somebody. And who were they designed by? And if they were designed by a white man who might be a racist white man, then and who is he designing that algorithm for? You know, and who is that algorithm not for? And so when you get into precision data and precision agriculture, there's going to be a lot of racism. There's going to be a lot of problems. The precision ag and digital ag are not being designed with farm worker rights in mind. Those digital ag platforms and precision ag platforms are not being designed with worker health or public health. They're being designed with a customer in mind, and those customers are Syngenta and ChemChina and Monsanto and Bayer and Dow and DuPont. And so I think we have to be really careful with this obsession with technology to solve very complex problems. I don't think that we can turn to technology to solve problems around equity and race and, you know, chemical addictions in our food system. Because again, it might be a technology and an algorithm, but somebody at some point designed that. And it all comes back to that bias that we as individuals have. And if we're trying to make a system change, we need to be thinking holistically. And when we're speaking about agriculture, we need to see agriculture as a whole ecosystem and really look at the data of what's working, not focused on systems that are going to line the pockets of more Silicon Valley investors.
Yeah. Well, I wanted to ask one more question to end it on a positive note, because I actually just saw literally this morning, I got an email about a victory in a campaign that I know Friends of the Earth
Yes.
was involved in around GMO salmon, which I mean, most people already don't even know that there's an effort to have
Yay.
GMO salmon. So tell us just a little bit about what this campaign was, who you worked with on it. Uh,
Yeah.
yeah.
Well, it's an ongoing campaign and it's a huge coalition effort. It's not just Friends of the Earth, but we're working with Native American tribes up and down the West Coast, like the Kanal Indian Nation, and working with groups like the Community Alliance for Global Justice, and working with North Atlantic Marine Association on the East Coast. It's a huge coalition effort that has been happening for the past 20 years. of trying to stop the release onto the market of the U.S.'s first genetically engineered animal, which is a genetically engineered salmon, and it was approved in 2015, despite 15, 20 years of work to block the approval. And so my campaign work was to try and stop it from being approved, but in case it was approved, we've been running market campaigns so that way stores and companies won't buy it. So the idea is that even if it's on the market, nobody will buy it. And so at this point, over the past 8 years almost, we've been going grocery store by grocery store, company by company to make public commitments. Even if the genetically engineered salmon comes to market, we will not buy it, period. And so the most recent win was Airmark, which is one of the top 3 food service management companies. They supply a lot of dining halls, and prisons, and stadiums,
Probably
and
the cafeterias at UC Santa Cruz if they were open.
It might be. It might be. So now we've gotten the top 3. We've gotten Airmark, Sodexo, and Compass Group to all commit to not selling genetically engineered salmon. And the idea is that you can have a company that's allowed to put a product on the market, but if there's no consumer demand and no company is willing to sell it, then the hope is that it won't be released into the environment, it won't be released onto the market. And ideally, we would have an FDA that wouldn't have approved it in the first place, but given that they did, then we need to turn to making sure consumers are speaking loudly and that the companies are listening. So that was a pretty awesome example of a lot of, that you can win, that we can win. And it takes a lot of intersectional campaign work, working with people from all different sectors to have different tactics. We're not all working on the same strategy and the same thing, but we're all working together across the whole spectrum of strategies. And hopefully, one by one, company by company, we'll make sure that the genetically engineered salmon, doesn't make it into the environment, because if it does, it's very clear that it will likely wipe out wild salmon, and that's part of why Washington has banned it and Oregon has banned it, and that all of the indigenous councils have banned and opposed it, and Alaska has opposed it, because it will wipe out our all of our native wild salmon populations and have pretty drastic impact on fishing communities and indigenous communities. And that doesn't even go into the health impacts, which are also horrific.
But it sounds like
yay for wins. Occasionally we win.
That's impressive. I mean, I don't remember the statistics, unfortunately, but I know Sodexo, Aramark, and Compass Group encompass a huge percentage of the food that's eaten by people in this country because of so many institutions that people get their food through.
Yeah. And Walmart won't do it, and Costco won't do it, and Kroger's won't do it. So we're really blocking off the market. And it's because consumers don't want it. People understand that food is important, and people do care about where their food is from, how it's raised, what the impact is on their bodies, on communities, on the environment. And it's just about making sure that the truth of what those products are is actually out there in the world. So it's a lot of education. Once people know what the product is, they can make a decision. But these companies spend a lot of money to block any transparency. Yeah. So we do win when we work together and we do it over a very long arc. We can slowly start moving the needle.
Yes. Well, thank you so much for sharing all of this info and passion and commitment to the long arc of that work. And I know you all are hiring right now. I don't know if any of the students have bandwidth for taking on a new job, but I know there's open
full time.
Yeah, I was also gonna mention, I know that wasn't Uprooted and Rising has also been involved in the
Uprooted and Rising has been wonderful. They are an incredible partner, brilliant organizers, and they played a huge role in the most recent win with Airmark.
Yeah, and I just wanted to mention that because they're a student-based organization, so they
organize on college campuses and maybe even in Santa Cruz.
Yeah, so that's something that students should be aware of.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well,
Shout out to Uproot and Rising.
yeah. Well, thank you so much. And I guess we'll see
Thank
you
you.
in class in a couple weeks.
Fabulous. All right. Thank you.
I'm going to stop the